Welcome back. We're going to pick up on this timeline discussion from where we left off. When we left off, we were talking about the decision that was made at the Third Continental Congress. What kind of government do we need? We know we don't want to go with the unitary system because that is exactly how we left it. We did not want all the power to be in the hands of a central government, basically limiting what, and if we're using colors, you can kind of see what I'm doing here, limiting the decisions of the smaller subgroups. And we remember that Ben Franklin came forward and said the answer already is in front of us. I don't know why we're discussing this. We need to do what the Iroquois do and combine our and we're not tribes, we're states, but unify as one grouping, maintaining our own power. I mean, each individual little state, kind of similar to that of a country, can make decisions independently, and we'll have one central government. But as we're going to find out here, that truly doesn't do much. And so when we start to look at the Articles of Confederation, and every time I say Articles of Confederation, I can still hear that woman say the Articles in Confederation. Those people that live, they're not U.S. citizens, but they have all the rights of a U.S. citizen. They just crack me up. But if we look at the actual document of the Articles of Confederation, we see that there was some positives that came out of this. And in positives, I mean, we actually took some of the items that were written into the Articles of Confederation and dropped them into the Constitution because that was something that we thought was successful and worked under the Articles of Confederation. So the first one I want to touch base on is this full faith and credit clause. Now, the idea of the full faith and credit is something we actually still recognize today. What the full faith and credit clause basically is saying is that if a license is issued or permission to do something is granted in one state, it's going to be recognized in all states. And so when we look at what exactly does that mean, marriage licenses are an example of where we still see full faith and credit operating. Full faith and credit being that if I get married in the state of Minnesota and I move to another state, that state that I move to is going to recognize my marriage license from Minnesota, and I'm not going to need to go through another marriage ceremony or get another marriage certificate in another state because it will be recognized. Now, when we come back to lecture, you guys are more than, somebody can ask me about how did that not originally apply to same-sex marriages. I can definitely go more in depth on that. Another example of full faith and credit that's recognized within the United States is someone's driver's license. I have no idea who this is. I just actually went on Google and this is the one that popped up. So I don't even know if this is a real person, but whatever. So when I went to Wisconsin this weekend, I didn't have to stop and prove that I could drive. Minnesota's driver's license is recognized in all 50 states. If Minnesota gave me the permission, therefore, then I have the permission in all 50 states. Where we do not see full faith and credit is when we start talking about professional licensing. Professional licensing is something that's completely separate, that does not operate the same as a marriage license and a driver's license from one state to the next. And so I find it really interesting that if I were to decide to go to Wisconsin to teach, even with my 28 years of experience, there are still 2 classes I would need to take in order for Wisconsin to give me certification to teach within that state. So when it comes to professional licensing, and we look at teaching, we look at medicine, we look at law, we look at economic licenses. They are not the same state to state, and every state can require something different when it comes to professional licenses. So that's the first thing we found in the Articles of Confederation, is that if Maryland gave a license to someone, Delaware would recognize it, and they didn't need to go from each technically little country and get that license again. The other thing that was put into the Articles of Confederation that still we see today is what is called extradition. Now, extradition is unique, and I'm going to put this here so that we can make sure we have this word, extradition. Extradition means that if someone has committed a crime in one state and leaves the state and is found in another state, the original state can request to come in, take that person into custody, and bring them back to the state where the crime was committed. Now, the example that I have here is actually a woman from Minnesota. This is a couple of years ago. She killed her husband and then went to Florida, where she killed another woman, took her identity, and was eventually caught in Texas. And so Minnesota, how extradition works is and let me just change my color here so you can kind of see this. The governor of Minnesota had to request, and I know this is kind of confusing, the governor of Minnesota had to contact the governor of where she was found. She was eventually, the extradition actually started with Florida getting her from Texas. And so the governor of Minnesota had to talk to the governor of Florida and request that she come back to Minnesota to stand trial for her crimes. To my knowledge, I don't know if she actually made it back, because the thing with it is she was found guilty in Florida for killing the woman and stealing her identity, that I'm not even certain if I'd have to go forward and look if Minnesota Governor Tim Walz even went through with getting her brought back to Minnesota, because she's serving a life sentence in Florida. And Minnesota's kind of got the idea that, do we really want to spend the money to send somebody down to get her when she's already in custody serving a life sentence in Florida? But the idea being, if someone commits a crime in one state, are they safe and free in another state? And that answer is no. But there is it's a pretty in-depth legal process to bring that person back. I mean, it's not just, can we come in and get this person? There's some legal paperwork that has to be done. And the interesting thing is that the governor, now say for example, in this particular case, the governor said, no, you can't. The Supreme Court has already ruled that that is possible. In a case called Kentucky v. Denison. This was during the slavery 1800s. The state of Kentucky contacted the governor of Ohio. So here's your governor of Ohio. And what was happening was there were slaves being moved out of Kentucky and moved into Ohio. Ohio was a free state. Okay, so Kentucky contacts the governor of Ohio and says, we would like to come into your state and apprehend X, Y, and Z. And the governor of Ohio asked, what was the crime? And the Kentucky governor said, the crime is theft. They're stealing. And of course, the governor of Ohio, coming from a free state, asked the governor of Kentucky, what is it that is being stolen? And the Kentucky governor said, slaves. And Denison responded back to the governor of Kentucky and said, I don't even know what that is. And of course, the Kentucky governor knows he's playing this game and says, people are coming into our state and taking slaves off of property and moving them into Ohio, which is considered property theft. And Denison said, we're a free state. We don't have slaves here. And so obviously the Kentucky governor then challenges that, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And what comes out of that is that a state can deny extradition if what the crime is in question is not a crime in that particular state, which is exactly what the governor was saying here. Denison is saying slavery is not even is not even allowed in Ohio. So how can I allow somebody to come into Ohio and take someone into custody for something that isn't even a crime here? So governors do have the right to deny extradition. The third thing that came out of the Articles of Confederation was this idea of what's called privileges and immunities. Now, privileges and immunities are unique and sometimes kind of difficult for some people to understand. I never remember how to spell privileges. Whoops. Having trouble, don't know why. So basically what this one is saying is that if a state citizen is given a permission to an activity, non-state citizens have that right to. Okay. Again, very vague, but I think it makes more sense when we start looking at hunting licenses. Minnesota residents are given permission to hunt. They're given permission to fish. Privilege and immunity says you can't deny someone else from another state from that right as well. Okay, so doesn't mean it has to be exactly the same. Example I've always used is my dad going deer hunting. He used to go mule deer hunting in Montana. Well, he had to get a license from Montana, and there were limited number of out-of-state licenses given than there were to residents of the state of Montana. The other thing is they don't have to be the same price. Minnesota allows non-Minnesotans to come in and hunt if they have the license, if they meet the requirements, but they don't have to be the same exact requirements. The other place we see this, and you guys I know are looking at this as well, is public post-secondary education. Okay, what you have here is a map of reciprocity. So does it mean that if I am a student here in Minnesota, I'm a resident of Minnesota, and I want to go to another state to college, that I can't because I'm not from that state? Privilege and immunities would state no, that I have to have the right to apply to a public university outside of my state. Now, do they have to have the same requirements? Absolutely not. We know that if you are a Minnesota resident and you want to go to school in Iowa, it is a very different cost between the two states, and that Iowa, you can't get in-state tuition unless you've actually become a resident of the state of Iowa, which is, I think, a 1-year process before you can even get in-state residency. So is there like an agreement between Minnesota and Wisconsin? Yes. Is there an agreement between Minnesota and North Dakota? Yes. Minnesota and South Dakota, I do not believe there is, and I know for sure there is not with Iowa. But are you denied from going to school in Iowa because you're a Minnesota resident? No. And vice versa is the same case. So those three things are not only put into the Articles of Confederation, they will eventually become part of the U.S. Constitution as well, which we'll talk about at a later time. Two other things that are in here is that the states were given the power to deal with the military. And we'll get into the treaties issue here in just a second. So again, if you don't understand these as I've explained them, make a note of that in your notes so that when we come back together again, I can go back and explain it again, maybe in a different way to help you. So full faith and credit, extradition, and privileges and immunities. Now, as much as I would like to say that the Articles of Confederation were great, we know the truth, they were not. And here are the things that the central government, and I want to make sure I make that point. The central government could not do. They were not allowed to do these things. Okay, so as we get more into this list, we're going to see why the Articles of Confederation didn't last forever. Okay, here's the things that the central government could do and oversee and states could do. But now we're going to look at what the central government was not allowed to do. The central government was not allowed to tax. Okay, there was no way that the central system was able to get money. Okay, so there was no way this central system had to raise revenue. And without revenue, you're not going to exist. So that was the first and the biggest downfall of the Articles of Confederation, was there was no money. The central government could not draft soldiers. It was still in the agreement from the, whoops, where did I go? It was still in the agreement from the Second Continental Congress, if I can find that, going back to the states volunteering militaries. Okay, so the national government, the central government wasn't allowed to draft soldiers. The central government could create treaties with another country, agreements with another country, but there was no way for them to actually enforce those treaties. So it's one thing to give them the power, but give them power to create something, but not to make sure it's put into effect, makes that power right here obsolete if you don't have the ability to enforce it. Interesting enough, in the Articles of Confederation, they identify an executive, but they don't give the executive any power whatsoever. And they said there will be no unified court system. So the 13 states had their own individual courts and laws and rules and consequences, but there wasn't a system set up that there were laws and rules that applied to all 13 states, because keeping in mind they were kind of their own little independent country. Now, if they were going to pass a new law, now there's a big difference here, and this is going to come back. Say, for example, they wanted to pass a law about being more specific on extradition or more specific on full faith and credit. It would only require 9 of the 13 to pass that law. However, if they wanted to change the articles themselves, anything that was directly written in this document, it was going to require all 13 states to be in agreement. And that is going to become a major point once we get into the Constitution itself. So again, they could create laws and need 9 of 13, but if they didn't have all 13 states agreeing to change the Articles of Confederation and change something within the document itself, then there was no passage of a new change to the Articles. So if they wanted to change the executive or they wanted to have a unified court system, all 13 states were going to need to be in agreement. So when we look at this document, hindsight, it wasn't the greatest of documents because there were so many things that the central government wasn't allowed to do. However, this is the document that gets us through a war with a major power on the globe at this point. So moving forward out of the Articles, not necessarily that much forward, is the Battle of Yorktown. And this is the battle where the British will surrender. Okay. And it's a big turning point, huge turning point for the United States as it's defined itself in the Declaration of Independence. But this is the point where the British finally say, we surrender. And this country of citizen army crazy defeats a world power. And so to finalize this, and it takes time, if you look at dates, there's definitely some time in there, and news traveled slowly. So when they surrender in Yorktown, there's still conflict going on in other states, and slowly but surely that information travels. So to finalize and end this war officially, we end up with the Treaty of Paris. And this is where the British Crown has to be a little bit humble. So in the Treaty of Paris, they're going to acknowledge that the United States is indeed free and independent of Great Britain. They agree that the prisoners of war from both sides will be released to their respective side. They also agree that any use of this giant river that goes where, well, obviously we know now, both countries will be able to use for trade and travel. But here's the big issue. In the Treaty of Paris, it is agreed that the United States will assume all war debt, which essentially puts us in a debt right from the beginning. And that by this date, all states and the country of Great Britain will be fully in recognition of the agreements in this document. Okay, so when we consider this, we declare our independence on 7/4/1776, and Great Britain does not even acknowledge that for quite some time. And so finally, we are able to consider ourselves free and independent, even though we had considered ourselves free and independent for over 13 years. No, actually more than that. So I'm going to end this lecture here, and then I will pick up on the next one with the Constitutional Convention.